Hello, Chevara and Bacardi. How are you?
Doing great. Great to see you. Thank you.
So good to be in
Yeah,
community with you. Yeah.
always, always, always. Where are you, Chevara? Where are you?
I'm coming in from South Florida, land of the Tequesta, Calusa, and Seminole. More specifically, I'm actually in Bacardi's house. I am here recovering from surgery. So I am here with
Oh,
Bacardi right now.
okay. Well, Bacardi, now I have to ask you where you're
I'm,
at.
I'm in that same land.
For people who don't know, this is Bacardi Jackson and Chevara Orrin, both just miracle workers in their own right, but I want to give them a chance to tell you a little bit about themselves. So I'll start with you, Bacardi.
Thank you so much. So I am, I guess, most importantly, mother of three teenagers who are my reason for a lot of the things that I do. I am also a civil rights attorney for a large civil rights organization, and I focus on children's rights and focus on eradicating poverty, on decriminalizing and decarcerating our youth, and stopping the school to prison pipeline, ensuring that we have mental health access and supports for children, and also trying to keep public funds in public schools to protect that institution, which is deeply under attack at the moment. So that's the work that I am happily and gratefully doing for the past couple of years. And beyond that, I do a number of other things in the community and sit on boards that are really important in terms of trying to provide education at our Broward College, for instance. I also am working on a project, Dialogues and Democracy, trying to bring civic engagement back into our communities and enrich young people. And I also have a long history of been a lawyer for about 23 years now. I came out of private practice with a Black-owned firm in Philadelphia. We have a lot of threads of connection. And also had a history of running mentoring programs and working with young women and starting mentoring programs, which has been a really important thing for me as well, and empowering and lifting up the voices of and seeing young women thrive. So really impressed me that we have a lot of roads that we are plowing next to each other.
Kindred spirits, yeah. Chevara, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for having me. It is so beautiful to be in community for both of my sisters here today. I am mother, daughter, sister, auntie, also survivor of childhood sexual violence. In my professional realm, I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. So I spend much of my time with corporations and institutions across the globe, helping them to reimagine not just inclusive workspaces, but some of the more radical conversations that we've been having since the murder of George Floyd have been around corporate reparations. How do we dismantle systems? The question that's on a lot of the executives' minds that we are posing, am I complicit in upholding systems of inequity that I purport to want to dismantle? I'm also an independent filmmaker, public speaker, published author, and currently working on a documentary, Why is Washington Still Burning?, that chronicles the radical actions of a group of 100 white and Jewish activists who were in support of Black people during the 1968 uprising, days after Dr. King's assassination. Our mother, Sue Orrin, who is a white Jewish activist, civil rights, human rights, anti-war activist, and Rabbi Waskow led these actions. And it was extraordinary because it's a little known story that's not in any history books. And so that's something I'm working to bring towards the forefront. I've had a long history in the nonprofit sector. I do a lot of work in the LGBTQ community. I'm two social justice campaigns, We Are Straight Allies, specifically to raise awareness and move forward policies in housing, employment, and accommodations for the LGBTQ plus community. And also another campaign, White and Woke, specifically for white folks who are committed to dismantling structural racism within their own white communities.
You all have incredibly impressive resumes, incredibly impressive lives. And just saying, like, how do you have the same 24 hours as everybody else? So I want to go back and start with how we first met. And and in my mind, we have two first meetings, right? We have the meeting years ago in 2004, when you first came to Selma. And then when I slid into your DMs last year to reintroduce myself. So years ago in 2004, I was living in Selma, Alabama, living and working in Selma, Alabama. And one of the jobs that I held was at the National Voting Rights Museum, as all-around person curating and doing programs and any number of things. And one evening we were putting on a program in celebration of Reverend James Bevel. It was a program it was a foot soldiers program that we put on several times a year to honor people from the movement. And Reverend Bevel had just moved to Selma, and it had caused quite a stir because he was such a celebrated member of the movement. And so the museum decided to honor him. And on that evening, the two of you, accompanied by several of your siblings, came into the program. And I remember very clearly you coming in because my friend and I seated you when you came in. The program had just started and we seated you. And I remember thinking, there's an odd feeling about you all coming in. You weren't really jubilant necessarily. You were sort of serious and sat down and were quiet for most of the program. And what I didn't know, what I learned later, is that you all were there actually to confront Reverend James Bevel, who is your biological father.
Right.
That was our first meeting.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to add to that, to talk about that meeting.
Yeah, sure. It was, as you talk about this, all these emotions come up around that time. It was a hard moment. There were about 10 of us siblings, and we have a total of 16, one just recently deceased. And we had all come together over the course of a couple of years leading up to, or at least a year leading up to that particular event. And what had prompted us to come together is that many of us in our own ways had confronted our father about his sexual abuse and other things, including his inability or unwillingness to parent his many children, but most especially the abuse. And when our youngest sister had been born, we were all very deeply concerned. And in fact, when she was first born, I had confronted him in a pretty hostile way by letter. And he had invited us to come and meet with him and have a hearing, so to speak, which quickly turned into kind of a mess, as you can imagine. And it was not very productive. At that point, we were strategizing, figuring out what to do. How could we protect this little girl who we knew would be in danger? And we contacted he was living in Chicago. We contacted the Department of Child Welfare in Chicago. We reached out to Oprah. We reached out to a lot of places just trying to figure out what can we do to protect her. And we were basically told there was nothing that could be done because no one had ever pressed charges against him. No one had ever held him accountable, and there was no record. And so it sat for a while, and our oldest brother, or next to oldest brother, had learned about us and had come to meet many of us sisters, and for the first time had heard what happened to us. And so he started us anew in saying, oh, this is unacceptable. We have got to go get our little sister. And so at that point, she was about 7. And we worked literally for a year, and we were tutored by Diane Nash, who is one of my personal sheroes, a person with the greatest ethical boundaries that I know. And she tutored us in the 6 steps of nonviolent resistance, and tutored us in the notions of love and truth, and that anything we did had to be grounded in those principles or it would not work, which resounded since many of us had tried a lot of other methods that did not work.
Right.
And I had a hard time fathoming how we would apply the principles from the civil rights movement to this very personal thing. But it was the first thing that actually did work. We set down our objectives, which was to protect our sister and all other children who would be in touch with him. And we moved on from there and started that process of working through each of those steps. And the first step was just saying out loud or in writing what happened to us, because we had talked about it vaguely. Something had happened, but no one had said specifically, and we had not had those conversations. Many of us didn't grow up together. Chevara and I did, but others of our siblings we didn't grow up with. And it was the first time, I think, for most of us, that all of us knew exactly what had happened. And so it took us almost a year to come to an agreement and figure out what to do. And we decided we would take all of this research and information we had been gathering. We researched all of the laws. We knew we could not bring charges in several of the states because of statute of limitations, which were only 1 year after turning the age of majority. We knew there were only a couple of states that were still an option. We just did a lot of work, and we put together this information, and we decided we would first confront him. And so that's what we learned about this event, and we got together, and there were about 10 of us who came, and we came to essentially get our little sister and to shut down any contact he was having with children around him.
Yeah, it was a really intense evening, and it's very interesting when I always remember you, both of you, mostly because over the years I've seen you, the two of you, more than other siblings. But I just always remember that evening and remember meeting you and knowing something was wrong. At the time, those of us in the community did not know that Reverend Bevel had the history that he had sexually abused his children or anybody else. But there was a feeling that something was wrong in that camp as well. And when I was writing the book, you all have an experience that you were having in that time period, and I was having a separate experience, similar but different, in the same community, also with Reverend Bevel. And I knew that I was going to have to recount that experience in the book in order to tell the actual story of how the Me Too movement started. But I was I felt tender, that's the best word I can think of, about including, more than anybody else I included in the book, even though you all are not named at all, about talking about the topic without talking to you first. And so our second meeting was, I'm sure, a very random message on Facebook last year, probably late last year, early this year, when I said, you don't know me. I met you at some point 15 years ago. This is who I am. This is what I'm doing. And I just want your permission, essentially, to tell this story, because it's not just mine. And it will affect you when it's out in the world. It may bring attention to you that you don't want. It may bring up things that you don't want to, that you put away, that you don't want to deal with. And that, I don't know how you feel about that moment, but for me, it has sparked this relationship between us that is so valuable to me and has been so, it wasn't even what I was looking for or expected, but meeting the two of you, actually meeting you this time, and building the relationship, and particularly building it while I was writing the book, was an invaluable experience. I talk about y'all all the time, just in that I've never met two survivors in particular, who have who've embraced their journey in the way that you have, and you have such a very unique specific journey. And so that's why I wanted to have this conversation, because I think beyond the, obviously there's a part of this that is about who your father was and who he meant to the world. But there's another part that is really about who you all are. And I think that part is so much more important for other survivors to hear, and people who have read this book to understand as a backstory, because it's so moving to me, and it's been so helpful in my continued journey. So I want to ask, and I'll start with you, Chevara. When you read the book, generally, but also on that part, how did it land for you?
Thank you for that question. And I want to say something about what you just said. A couple of things are really striking for me. One, in that moment when you met us and when you talked about this recognition that there was some tension, unsure as to what that was, but there was some tension. As you were talking about it, what I was remembering is while we were on a very specific strategic journey that Bacardi just laid out beautifully, the juxtaposition was all of these people coming to the stage, one after the other, not just talking about the work that our father has done in the world as the civil rights icon, the March from Selma to Montgomery, the Birmingham Children's Crusade. They were talking about how much they loved him and how he had shifted their lives in ways that made them better. And here we were sitting with this very difficult, dark secret, terrified that anyone would know, because that's not why we were there. We weren't there to out him. We weren't there to confront him publicly. We were there gathering information. For us, that was more of the research. And the juxtaposition of hearing it. And I know at the time I was really struggling. I don't struggle anymore. I've made peace with it in my own journey, but I was struggling with holding space for the nuance of that. I had not quite figured out my own journey. And so I wasn't able in that moment to hold the type of space that I hold and the type of grace that I hold, not just for myself and my siblings, but for our father. And so I wanted to mention that. And then you said something else that I think is so powerful, Tarana, that you reached out to us because it wasn't just your story to tell, that our stories were inextricably bound. And we share a Facebook friend, and she just wrote a post about this the other day. She did a blog. When the story isn't just yours, what is the responsibility? And Bacardi and I have talked about this. Even when we think about sharing our own journey more publicly, we are connected to a 16-person sibling group.
Yeah.
And while collectively we have experience with our father, we also have very individual lives. And so I deeply appreciate and respect you reaching out to us around that. Broadly, when I think about your book, and it's so powerful, and it is such a gift. It is such a gift. I think about this quote from Lucille Clifton, where she says, in the bigger scheme of things, the universe is not asking us to do something. The universe is asking us to be something, and that's a whole different thing. And you have chosen, with your journey, with your voice, with your survivorship, to be something. It is in the being. We are human beings. And so that's the first thing that struck me, that this book is instructional in how to be, not so much how to do, not how to create a movement, how to be a movement, how to be the truth teller, how to be the truth seeker, how to be a survivor in the way that you have chosen and navigated survivorship. There's something that you say in the book. You talk about the hypocrisy, the apathy, and the depth, and the culture of secrecy and silence. And I was thinking about when in community, particularly our Black community, I identify wholly and fully as a Black woman, the complexity of when you are both perpetrator and victim. And what does it mean when we are so worried as Black community about the white gaze that continues to demonize, pathologize Blackness? and at the
Mhm.
same time have to hold accountable Black men, fathers, uncles, grandfathers, great grandfathers, pastors, teachers, you name it, across the gamut, right? And the burden of that for Black women. And so that was something that really, really resonated with me. And when you share um, our connection, the intersection of our lives, and you talk about the letter that you remember reading, and when you reached out to us, you had that, you sent that to us as a text. And it was the first time that I have read it since then, when you
Wow.
sent it to us a few months ago. I have not reread that since that moment. And I was amazed. I was reading it thinking, this is this is such good strategy. And there is so much love in this accountability.
Can I just, so I just for context for people, just the letter that you're referring to is your family, your sibling group that took this task on, sent out, made several attempts to get help from the community, because Reverend Bevel was such a monumental figure in the movement. You sent letters out to movement people across the country, right, to try to get support. And you did that more than once, right? You sent out,
Yeah.
two groups, or at least two groups of letters to try to get support, which is another place that we intersect. But we'll talk about that later. But continue. I just wanted to, that the letter was referring to was saying, this is who we are. This is what happened to us, and our father did this to us, and we need your help in holding him accountable. That letter, I didn't put it. Obviously, I didn't put it in its entirety in the book. But it is also beautifully crafted, as you said, and it's such a lesson in how we can talk about accountability, think about accountability. This is a question that we grapple with, those of us in this work and doing movement work, grapple with all the time. What does accountability look like? What does community accountability look like? But I mean, I know you said you were tutored by Diane Nash, and it's certainly, you can see the principles are alive and well in the letter. But even when I read it, I'm like, wow, this is just the opposite of the flip side of what we talk about. We talk about the culture of complicity, right? You can look that directly in his face by saying, listen, we will not be complicit in this. We want to ring the alarm about this person, and we need your help. And that's why the letter was so clear and so the level of authenticity and bravery, even, and like the courage to do that is just amazing. But I wanted to make sure I didn't completely cut you off, Chevara, if you wanted to.
Oh, no. I just was thinking about in that moment of, in the way that you talk about our father, James Bevel, in the book, and your response to that letter. There's a part, after you'd gotten to a certain point, you stopped reading, and I was imagining, as I was reading it, what might have been, also running through your mind, because you are an activist. Like, I need to take action. I have information, and the way that information came to you, right? Because the letter wasn't directed to you,
me.
and yet the universe somehow ensured that information came to you so that you could be a leader in that community, and that you could then begin to heal that community.
Yeah, that's something that I actually struggle with, and I think I talk about that a little bit in the book, because by the time I got the letter that I got was from the second batch that y'all sent out, and so a bunch of things had already transpired that I didn't know, which was why I was so shocked when I saw it. I realized that people in the community knew very clearly who he was and what he had done, and they had not rung the alarm. So at the point that I saw the letter, he had kind of moved away from Selma and had gone to Greene County and was just sort of coming back and forth. But it caused me to think back to the previous year of like, we went almost a year and a half with this information just being public and nobody said anything. And so it gave me a little bit of a paralysis, right? I felt like, well, what do I do? I don't feel, if people who have bigger profiles, bigger access, more power, more privilege than I do, didn't, make a full court press to ensure that everybody knew, what can I do? And what I could do was pour that energy into the work that I was doing in the community with the girls. That was the best that I could figure to do. Like I can't. I just, and I think about that a lot when I was writing a book. Even I'm like, what is my role? I think we all played a role. We all had some level of complicity, some more than others. But I feel like my response to that had to be what I did with Me Too. It was so much turmoil, just like, who did I fail? Who slipped through the cracks? Because we didn't know in time, because we didn't have enough information. One thing I wanted to ask you about, both of you about, was about the thing that's so interesting to me about you both is that your lives, even though, and I don't know, maybe this is DNA, right? Like, it's not just your father who was this monumental figure. Your mom is this amazing organizer, activist in her own right. Do you think it was inevitable that you were going to do social justice work?
Since all of my mother's children do, probably. But I do want to just address one thing quickly before jumping a little bit back into that, and that is, back to the letter, is your response was one of many really different responses. And even something you just said that was just resonating so with me about like who slipped through the cracks. Part of our motivation, at least for me, when I learned about what was happening or had happened to others of our younger siblings, and Chevara and I are on the older half of the sibling group, I was crushed. Not only because of what Jim did, but because I had not stopped it. And you can't help but hold this incredible amount of guilt. What if I had seen? What if I had said? What if I had interjected? What if I had called my little sister? What if I had checked in on her? I could have stopped so much harm. Right. And you think about, once something like that happens to someone, they are never who they would have been. Mm-hmm. And so in writing that letter, that was a huge motivation. We were really trying to figure out, how do we let parents know? How do we let people know? After he refused to, the solution we had presented to him, which was he needed to admit himself into psychiatric care. He needed to immediately relinquish the rights of parenting our sister, and remove himself from children permanently. Those were the kinds of things we set out. But there was a tremendous amount of responsibility that I felt personally, and I think many of us felt. And to your point about the many stories, and I must say, of the 16 of us, all 16 of us have very different perspectives about what happened, about what we should have done, about what we did do, whether we are wrong talking about it now. Like there's a host of stories that come from all of those perspectives. And I don't want to, suggest that we represent the fullness of that spectrum. Right. But it is a tremendous amount of concern that you hold when you love people to whom this has happened. And what was most tragic and shocking to me in sending out that letter and reaching out for him is how many people told us to shut our mouths. How many people told us we would bring bad
Yes.
things to the civil rights movement and the legacy and the history and our own legacy and our own history and what we were shooting ourselves in the foot about. And, why couldn't we just be quiet? And so your response was the response we expected. We did not, at least I did not expect the response we got from so many others, many of whom had walked with him for a long time. I was angry, and I had this sense of, how dare you even ask us to not say
You
something?
have you have a right to be. I mean, you all know the struggle that I've been in since the book came out, and the people who are named in the book as complicit. The reason that story is in the book is specifically to talk about a culture of complicity and a culture of silence in our community. And one of the things that has come up is that group of people feel like, because they did respond to the letter and they did respond to you, and they had this, community hearing that was the only time, or the first time, that James Bevel said publicly that he actually did molest and rape his daughter, that they had done their job, right, in getting him to admit it. And what I'm saying, and I thought I said pretty clearly in the book, is that your job was not that. That wasn't the job. It's like a tree falling in the forest, right? If him saying it, I think you did more than everybody else, right? They did more than the other civil rights icons who closed the door on you and said, we don't want to deal with this, and you should not talk about this, and try various ways to shut you down. So yes, but the question comes up, what is our job? When you put yourself out as a leader in a community, you take on a responsibility. And it's inherently built into the role of leader. If you set yourself out as a leader, then there's an expectation. Particularly if you are saying that you're leading or guiding children, young people, and inside of our community. And what I'm trying to say in the book is that my expectation was that you would do everything possible to protect not just your sister, who was the primary person who needed protection in that moment, but the children who Bevel had access to, the children who the people who came with Bevel had access to. There should have been a series of meetings, of more letters that went out. I mean, it could have been so many things to happen at the point that they learned that this was absolutely true. And another thing that's come up is like, there was fear of false accusations. And I'm like, again, these are the tropes that we lean on in our community over and over again. At what point are we going to deeply examine these things that have not served us at all, and just seek to keep perpetuating the same type of violence in our community over and over again? There's no fear of false accusations once he's admitted it. Right? And so, and especially since you all as the survivors have said, we're not even looking to engage law enforcement. I know there was some, back and forth about that, but essentially you were okay with not engaging law enforcement as long as he was removed from the community, your sister was safe, and people understood that there was a danger in having him around.
Yeah, no, Tarana, I was just going to say, when we were on this journey, at the core, at least for me, as we moved through it was restorative justice.
Exactly.
It was restorative justice. And I think what we were able to accomplish over the course of the years was possibility of within family, within Black community, what that could look like.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to, I don't want to go too far over our time, but there's something really that I want you all to talk about so much. And it's just the thing that strikes me about you both is how much grace and I'm trying to think, that's the word. I'm on a grace kick lately. So what's the word that comes to me first? But I really, and Chevara and I have had a lot of conversations about this. in the last several months, and this is what I mean about you both helping me. It took me a long time to tap into my anger about being a survivor. It took me a long time to see myself as a survivor and then to subsequently direct the anger at the persons who harmed me. And that was cathartic for me to do that because the anger was pointed inward before that. I was mad at myself. And then I went through a process of sort of, the forgiveness and the steps that many survivors go through. What strikes me about you, the both of you, is that you have there's so much nuance in your situation because this is your father. You had a complicated relationship outside of, or in addition to the abuse. But it seems to me that you all have found a way to move through the world with this reality as survivors in a way that I think it's so beautiful. The way you talk about it, the way you talk about your lives, even the way you talk about the process you went through. And I just want you to share a little bit of that with the people listening, because I'm just gonna say this, because I think that, everybody, we have different entry points into healing and our healing journeys, whatever. But I think that a lot of people don't think it's possible to find peace in the journey, to get to a place, because I don't know that until I had a real deep conversation with y'all, I realized that I don't even have the kind of peace that I want, right? The kind of peace that I'm looking for. I'm still coming into that in a particular kind of way, and not even for the people who harmed me necessarily, but I think it's about the complicity around my abuse of others. So I just want you to talk a little bit about how you got to that place.
Bacardi, why don't you, I know it's interesting because I was thinking about the question right before this that was tied to Sue, our mom, and I'm wondering if there is some intersection, I think, in the way that we were raised by our mother that might shed some insight, but please.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the question, and I think the issues you posed in the book about the complexity of people, and even when we look at ourselves, we all have this incredible capacity, right, to do incredible good or incredible evil, all of us. And another hero who once said, we are all better than the worst things we've ever done, that's a truth that lives with me constantly. And so one of my heroes, who is Brian Stevenson, who said, we are all better than the worst things or the worst thing we've ever done, is something that has always resonated with me, because we all have this capacity individually to do and be incredibly good or incredibly bad, all of us. And there's not a one of us who's immune to it. And so one of the things that was really remarkable about how our mother raised us, and she is just this incredible white Jewish woman who raised 3 Black children in predominantly Black settings and made sure we knew we were Black. We lived with the Black Panther Party. We grew up in Black community. We went to Black schools. We went to Black church. There was never sort of this question about identity. But there was also this incredible grace of all the things she went through about being a white woman in these spaces that she modeled for us and insisted upon us. The humility that she walked in the world with is something that was remarkable to see, but something I have always aspired to have, and don't think that I've ever been successful at her level, but it is a really important piece of how we were raised. And so she would stand in the middle of meetings where people were deciding whether she could stay in the meeting because she was pregnant with a Black child, or whether she could keep her children because how dare a white woman try to raise Black children. She just has had incredible courage, incredible humility, and has never, ever insisted on anybody recognizing, the things that she has had to deal with. And that's a pretty remarkable thing to grow up seeing. I think in terms of the way I have, learned to view one of the gifts that I got from my father is I've never put anybody on a pedestal. I'm not a groupie. I'm not somebody who's impressed by what people do, what their titles are, because I understand this capacity. I also understand the difference between an image and who people really are. One of the things that was the opposite of gift is that I think I have spent my life probably subconsciously repeating my relationship and finding my father over and over again. And meeting men who have been as abusive, who have, had these images of being something else than they are, having to survive domestic violence, surviving. And like you, I had not even seen myself as a victim. And as I've reflected on moments that I've had with, there's one instance in particular that I never even called rape, but it was because I had been in relationship and it didn't feel violent. It was absolutely unwanted. It was absolutely resisted, but it wasn't. And after all we had been through and the trauma of our lives didn't feel significant. And that is the thing that I think we as women have to really start to unravel for ourselves is understanding our boundaries are clear and cut and nobody gets to cross them, not even a little bit. There is no little bit of anything, whether that's a little hit or a little push or a little shove or a little unwanted sex. None of it is a little. And the clarity we have to build in our daughters and children around this to break these cycles is so important. And I'm so grateful that you have started this movement that lets us do that and lets us have those conversations.
Amen.
Whew, take a breath on that one. At our father's funeral, I sat with my mom for some of the time, and I sat with Diane Nash for some of the time. And in the same way that when we all first met in Alabama so many years ago, people were one by one, mostly men, walking up to the pulpit to talk about how our father had impacted their lives in unimaginable ways that were positive. And I remember that was a pivotal moment for me because I remember having this grace, the word you brought into our circle, around being able to, Bacardi, have the capacity for all of those things to be true. For all of those things to be true. And I think up until that moment, even during trial, what was interesting, and the trial went on for months and months throughout a year. He ultimately died of stage 4 pancreatic cancer 3 months after final sentencing. But in between trial, when there would be recess, we would be talking to our father in the corridor. The media who were there, the onlookers, you could see the bewilderment in their eyes that here we are in courtroom testifying against our father with clarity, with grace. The prosecutor said to us, in my 15 years of prosecuting rape, sodomy, incest, I have never met women, she said. So, she said strong, she said centered, she said that a lot of the women that she had worked with who were survivors were either continuing cycles of violence, they were institutionalized, she was just naming all these things, and she was saying that you all seem to be whole. Now, we were still on our journey. I know I could speak for myself. I don't know if whole is the word I would have used for myself then, but what she was saying is, she said, the level of capacity for grace that you all have in relationship to your father. She said she wasn't seeing the animosity, the anger, the hostility. And I can't speak, Bacardi made a beautiful point that all of us, there are 16 of us, our journeys are different and yet intersect. At that point, I was in that space. I wasn't consumed with the bitterness and the anger that had for such a very long time guided and informed not just my own life, but my relationship with men, my relationship with my siblings, my relationship with my sons who are now grown men. And when he died, I remember the judge asking, because he was in jail, and the judge was asking us as he was dying and his cancer was made known, how did we feel about that? Should he be released? Should he be kept in prison? And I know for me in that moment, my response was, I cared about the safety of our sister. I cared about the safety of community. He is dying of stage 4 cancer now. If someone wants to be with him when he dies and hold his hand and kiss his forehead, because none of us, I believe, to the point Bacardi made, in the words of Brian Stevenson, we are all better than the worst thing we have ever done, deserve, I don't think, to leave this world alone. We don't come into this world by ourselves. Now, I wasn't at the place where I wanted to be that person, but I certainly held space for the siblings and the people who loved him, who wanted to be with him as he made that transition. And that, for me, Tarana, the acknowledgement within my own self was a pivotal, powerful moment. And I realized that I had journeyed, and I didn't even know I had journeyed that far.
That's what I wanted. How did you get there? Because I remember when you told me that you went to the funeral, and I was surprised too. I said, I wonder, because so there's two things I think about. I remember I did a show one time where one of the women on the show was talking about being angry because the person who had sexually assaulted her had become super successful and had gone on to make millions of dollars and do all of this thing, and she had not had the same kind of success. And I remember saying to her, like, the thing is, if we predicate our healing on what they are doing and how their lives go, then we are blocking ourselves from having actual freedom, from the trauma, freedom from the experience, and all of the things. So intellectually, I understand having to fully release that person and the things that they've done in order for you to have a whole and full life. Intellectually. Now, in practice, though,
it's harder.
It ain't that easy.
And how do you get to the place when you're not just, because I can see releasing it and saying I freed myself of this and not going to the funeral or not speaking to him, during the trial. How do you get to that? Where does that come from? Is that from your mom? Is that just? I'm just curious.
For me, I want to talk, I had this amazing mentor when I lived in Atlanta. His name was Al Lingo. He was actually a comrade of Jim's, and had known him in the movement, and a really complex, interesting fellow in and of himself. But he mentored me for a while. And when I met him, he handed me a business card. He was with Ambassador Young, and he handed us this business card. I was with another sister, and he had a card that said he did love and forgiveness workshops. And I was like, oh, I need to talk to you. I need you, right? Like, so I was like, I'm showing up on your doorstep tomorrow. And I went through this beautiful journey with him for more than a year. I would he had this home that was open to anybody who wanted to come anytime. We would have Friday potlucks. Literally, his doors were open. People would come there. People came there to die. Like, it was an amazing space. And so he would lead us through meditations and conversations, silent dinners, parts of them. And so anyway, one of the things Mr. Lingo taught me was that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and it does not mean condoning. That was the first time I had ever been able to get to a place of forgiveness with my father, when I learned it did not mean I had to condone his behavior. It meant releasing him from the debt that I expected him to do anything else other than what he had already done in his life, which is the best he knew how to do, with whatever was going on in his head. And when I was able to do that release, the other part of the thing that is important when this stuff is complicated by familial relationships is that it doesn't matter how dastardly or horrible or horrific your parents are, as a child, you love them. And as much as you hate them sometimes, you love them. And at his funeral, when I cried, I realized how much I loved him and how much I was sad that there were so many conversations we still could not have. There were so many places of redemption he would never get to. And I cried for him. But I cried tears of joy too, that he died carrying his own cross, which meant that it could be lifted off of my shoulders and the shoulders of my sisters. And so it was powerful, but I was in a place of love, thanks to Al Lingo and Diane Nash. I know I wouldn't have been there otherwise, but those were the things that took me there.
and each other. The other important thing that I think in your story is that you have a community of family. Like we share, the bond of being survivors, but what you share as sisters and in the larger group of siblings, there's something to be said. Even the places that you disagree, there's also something to be said about how you were able to practice this with each other. It's like when you learn a thing, you're mentored by Diane Nash, whoever, and then it's just you trying to practice it in the world. It's more difficult than your sister, who also has these lessons, and you can put those into practice in other ways. I think you both are two of the most dynamic individuals I've ever met. I mean, I think however your story is told in ways that are respectful of the fact that there's other people, that it should be told, if for no other reason that it is such a story of possibility, of what is possible for us meaning survivors. And also there is, one of the things that I'm trying to be cognizant of is that while I want people to move from victim to survivor in language and in understanding, I also don't want us to be beholden to the survivor identity as our sole identity.
Right.
And I also think that you all, survivor is just a piece of your identity, and you have wonderfully lived these lives and shaped these lives that are so much bigger than the things that happen to you, which is what I say to survivors all the time. You are not the sum total of the things that happen to you, right? And I just think you all exemplify that in just beautiful ways. We probably should part two this.
Yeah, Tarana, I was just going to say that the one thing that I did want to add, it's interesting and something just resonated with me in the work that I do around racial justice, specifically in predominantly white corporate and institutional spaces. The journey with our father, and I mean that entire journey where we strategized, where we had trial, where we came to resolve, solution, or healing, depending on where people were at the entry point of the journey, informs and allows me to hold grace and space for white folks in ways that I know I would not be able to had I not had that experience. I am very, very clear. And it doesn't mean, Bacardi just made, that then white people are somehow not responsible for and accountable to dismantling systems of oppression and inequity that they ultimately as collective created. It does allow me, however, to think more broadly, again, about the nuance and hold that level of grace and space. And so in my corporate work, the work that I do around the globe, I share this story of survivorship because it is one that is absolutely inextricably bound to the work that I do in the social and racial justice space.
And one last point for me is that it's, as much as we want to move past the survivor, the other thing that's apparent from your story, and I know my experience, is also embracing and understand that we have been victimized in some way, because we have lived and grown up, and I had to have that tough persona. I said so many things that were in your book. I've had to finish a lot of fights as a kid. Me and my lasty lunchbox.
Yes, you did.
But it was a tough persona that is embedded in us to be strong Black women. And we sometimes have to redefine what strength means. Sometimes strength also means coming to grips with our own vulnerability and coming to grips with the fact that we didn't have the responsibility to make stuff not happen to us, because we feel like it's our fault that it did, because we're supposed to be these strong Black women who could have made it not happen in the first place. And so yes, we got to get past victimhood, but we also as Black women have a road to trod to understand in the first place, we have a right to be protected. We have a space to feel vulnerable. We have a space to acknowledge that something horrible happened to us.
Absolutely. And we deserve that space. We deserve it, and we should occupy that space. I think one of the biggest lessons I have taken from meeting you and just even this journey and writing the book, and this particular portion of it is just because, you know, the other part about knowing your father is that it wasn't just as, you know, him drifting through Selma. He had been coming through, even when I was in 21st century camps, you know, we had gotten life lessons from him for many years. Like one of I still to this day very much use the first principle of nonviolence. I will not violate your dignity, but I will not compromise it. You know, those are the things I remember about Reverend Bevel. It's not like he didn't enrich my life personally, or the people, you know, the Sanders family, very much so enriched my life, poured into me, and I have had to go through a process where I hold on to the gifts, and sometimes you have to hold on to the gift and release the gift giver.
Right.
And that is a difficult process, but it is a necessary process. And I try to do that I'm trying to do that with some grace, and in order for both of us, all of us, to have peace and to have, you know, we can sit with our complicity, we can sit with what accountability looks like, but we don't have to do that in struggle, right? These are some of the things that I've learned from you all, right? From being in community with you all. So we probably need to do this again. I'm sure that the video will probably bring about more questions, and maybe we can come back and answer some of those questions at another time. But I just really want to say thank you. And that was the other part of doing this, is to say thank you publicly for just how you show up in the world, how you showed up for me personally. I know at one point I felt like I was getting on your nerves. I was like,
no, not at all. Not at all.
You know, thank you for answering all my phone calls and sitting with me through some of those very tough moments, and even allowing yourself to open up to some really things that were tough memories for you all, and doing that, you know, in community with me. I just really just can't say enough about you all. Love you so much.
We too recognize an anointing when we see it.
Yes.
and we thank you for letting us be a part of your journey. Thank you. It's so delightful to walk with you and to see all of the lives you touch, for your authenticity and your vulnerability and all that you share. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank
yes.
You. And maybe we'll do this in person at some point.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.